On the day my wife passed away, my son-in-law knocked on my door with a summons. From now on, I run the family business. Accept it or forget you have grandchildren. I simply handed him a court order. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The dirt hadn't even settled on Eleanor's grave when Marcus showed up at my door. I was still wearing my funeral suit, the black tie loosened around my neck like a noose I couldn't quite escape. The house felt impossibly quiet without Eleanor's gentle humming from the kitchen, without her soft footsteps padding across the hardwood floors she'd spent 30 years polishing to perfection. I'd just poured myself a cup of coffee, the first thing I'd managed to keep down in 3 days, when the doorbell rang. Sharp, insistent, nothing like the gentle knock Eleanor always used when she forgot her keys. Through the peephole, I saw Marcus standing on my porch, his expensive suit pristine despite the October chill. My son-in-law had always been particular about his appearance, but there was something different about him today. His jaw was set in a way that reminded me of a wolf circling wounded prey. I opened the door slowly. "Marcus, I didn't expect to see you so soon after." "We need to talk, Melvin." He pushed past me without invitation, his leather shoes clicking against Eleanor's pristine floors. The sound made my chest tighten. She'd always hated when people wore shoes inside. "About what?" I asked, though something in his tone already told me this wasn't a condolence call. Marcus turned to face me in the living room, pulling a manila envelope from his jacket pocket. The sight of it made my stomach drop. After 40 years in business, I knew legal documents when I saw them. "About the future of this family," he said, his voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. "About who's going to take care of things now that Eleanor's gone." I stared at the envelope in his hands. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Marcus said, placing the envelope on Eleanor's coffee table with deliberate precision, "that things are going to change around here. The business, the house, the money, all of it needs proper management. And let's be honest, Melvin, you're not getting any younger." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was 62, not 90. I'd built a successful construction company from nothing, raised a daughter, maintained a marriage for 35 years. But standing in my living room in my funeral suit, I suddenly felt every one of those 62 years pressing down on my shoulders. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you how it's going to be. You're going to sign those papers, transfer management of Hartwell Construction to me, and step back from the day-to-day operations. It's what Eleanor would have wanted." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Don't you dare tell me what my wife would have wanted. She worried about you, Melvin. We all did. The stress, your age. She used to call Sarah crying about how exhausted you looked." Marcus sat down in Eleanor's favorite chair without permission, making himself comfortable. "This way, you can relax, spend time with the grandkids when we bring them by. No pressure, no responsibility." I opened the envelope with shaking hands. The legal jargon swam before my eyes, but the key phrases jumped out. Power of attorney, financial management, transfer of business assets. My entire life's work, signed away with a few pen strokes. "And if I don't sign this," Marcus's expression hardened, "then I guess you won't be seeing much of Tommy and Lisa anymore. Sarah agrees with me that it might be better if they don't spend time around someone who's unstable." The room spun. Tommy was 8. Lisa was 6. They were the light of Eleanor's world, and mine too. The thought of losing them so soon after losing her was unbearable. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious." Marcus stood up, straightening his tie. "Look, Melvin, I'm not the bad guy here. I'm trying to help. The kids need stability, consistency. Sarah needs support during her grief. And you, well, you need to focus on taking care of yourself." I stared at him. This man who'd married my daughter 7 years ago, who'd charmed us all with his MBA and his 5-year plans and his promises to take care of Sarah forever. This man who was now threatening to cut me off from the only family I had left. "I need time to think about this." "You have until Monday," Marcus said, picking up his envelope. "The lawyers are expecting the signed documents first thing Tuesday morning." "Oh, and Melvin?" He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "Eleanor's funeral was beautiful. She would have been proud." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my empty house. I sank into my recliner, Eleanor's chair still holding the impression of Marcus's body like a violation. The coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I didn't notice. All I could think about was the look in his eyes when he'd mentioned Eleanor's worries about me. Because here's the thing that Marcus didn't know. The thing that had been eating at me since the doctor called 3 days ago with words like, sudden cardiac event, and unexpected complications. Eleanor hadn't been worried about my health. She'd been worried about something else entirely. Something she'd discovered about Marcus and Sarah that had kept her awake at night, pacing the floors and making quiet phone calls when she thought I was sleeping. Something that had made her start hiding papers in places she thought I'd never look. Something that had made her whisper to me the night before she died, "Melvin, if anything happens to me, check the old recipe box, the one from my mother. There are things you need to know." I'd thought it was the medication talking, her mind clouded by whatever was making her so sick. But now, sitting in the wreckage of my life with Marcus's ultimatum burning in my hands, I wondered if Eleanor had been trying to tell me something far more important than I'd realized. Eleanor's recipe box sat on the kitchen counter where it had lived for 35 years, a faded yellow tin decorated with painted roses that had dulled to whispers of their former brightness. I'd walked past it 1,000 times without really seeing it, the way you stop noticing the wallpaper in your own home. But now, 3 hours after Marcus left, it seemed to pulse with significance. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, beneath decades of handwritten cards for pot roast and apple pie, my fingers found something that didn't belong. A manila folder, thin but heavy with secrets. The first thing I saw was a photograph of Tommy, my 8-year-old grandson, shirtless at what looked like a doctor's office, his back to the camera. Dark marks dotted his shoulder blades, too perfectly round to be birthmarks, too precisely placed to be accidents. In Eleanor's careful handwriting across the bottom, July 15th, Tommy says he fell downstairs again. My stomach lurched. I set the photo aside and reached for the next item, a small digital recorder, the kind Eleanor used to use for her book club notes. With shaking fingers, I pressed play. Sarah's voice filled the kitchen, thin and defensive. "Mom, you're overreacting. Kids get bruises. Tommy's clumsy, you know that." Then Eleanor's voice, strained with worry. "Sarah, honey, this isn't clumsiness." Lisa flinched when Marcus reached for her yesterday. She actually flinched. She was tired. "You're reading too much into everything." "I'm reading what's right in front of me. Look at this photo from Tommy's swimming lessons. Look at his arms, Sarah. Those fingerprint bruises on his upper arms. That's not from playing too rough." A long pause, then Sarah's voice, smaller now. "Marcus has been stressed. Work is demanding, and the kids can be difficult sometimes. He's not used to..." "To what? To children being children? Sarah, listen to yourself. You don't understand, Mom. Marriage is complicated. Marcus is a good provider, a good father. He just has high standards." The recording ended abruptly. I stared at the small device, my coffee cup forgotten in my hand. High standards. That's what Sarah called it. I picked up the next item, a medical report from Tommy's pediatrician, dated 6 months ago. The clinical language couldn't hide the concern. Patient presence with multiple contusions in various stages of healing. Parent reports frequent falls and rough play with siblings. Recommend follow-up in 2 weeks to monitor pattern of injuries. But there had been no follow-up. The next medical record was from a different doctor, across town. Then another from a walk-in clinic 40 minutes away. Eleanor had been doctor shopping with the kids, I realized. Trying to avoid questions, trying to keep anyone from seeing the pattern. At the bottom of the folder, I found Eleanor's own notes, written in the careful script I'd loved for 35 years. "Tommy asked me today why Daddy gets so angry when he spills things. He said he tries to be good, but sometimes his hands shake when Daddy looks at him. My heart is breaking. I should have seen this sooner. Lisa hasn't spoken above a whisper in weeks. She used to be so chatty, always singing, always laughing. Now she hides behind my legs when Marcus comes to pick them up. 6 years old, and she's already learning to make herself invisible. Sarah won't listen. She keeps making excuses, keeps saying I'm interfering. But I've seen the way she jumps when Marcus raises his voice. I've seen how she apologizes for things that aren't her fault. She's as trapped as the children are. I called the family court today to ask about custody options. The woman was very kind, very patient. She said grandparents' rights are limited, but in cases where children's safety is at risk, there are legal remedies. I have an appointment next Tuesday to speak with someone. Next Tuesday, the day Eleanor died. I sat back in my kitchen chair, the folder scattered across Eleanor's pristine table. My wife had been building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to fight for our grandchildren. And then suddenly, she was gone. The official cause of death was heart failure. Sudden, the doctor said. Sometimes these things just happen. especially to women Eleanor's age. Stress could be a factor, he'd mentioned gently. Had she been worried about anything lately? I'd said no, because I hadn't known. My wife had been carrying this burden alone, trying to protect me from it, even as it was killing her. My phone rang, startling me out of my spiral. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was carefully neutral. "I just wanted to check on you. See how you're holding up after the funeral." "I'm managing," I said, my eyes still on the photos scattered across the table. "How are the kids?" A pause. "They're fine. Marcus took them to get ice cream after we left the cemetery. They're resilient, you know. Kids bounce back faster than adults do." "Do they?" I asked. "Do they really, Sarah? What do you mean?" I looked at the photo of Tommy's back, at the medical reports, at Eleanor's careful documentation of a family in crisis. "When can I see them? Tommy and Lisa, I mean. I'd like to spend some time with them, with everything that's happened." "Well," Marcus thinks. We think it might be better to wait a little while, let things settle down. The kids are confused enough as it is, and having too many emotional conversations right now might not be healthy for them. Emotional conversations, like talking about their grandmother who loved them more than life itself, like acknowledging that they'd lost someone who'd been trying desperately to save them. "Sarah, are you happy?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. What kind of question is that? An honest one. Are you happy? Is your marriage what you wanted it to be? "Dad, you're grieving. You're not thinking clearly right now. Marcus and I are fine. The kids are fine. Everyone is fine. Fine." Eleanor used to say that fine was the most dangerous word in the English language. It was what people said when everything was falling apart, but they couldn't find the strength to ask for help. "Your mother was worried about you," I said carefully. "About all of you." And the silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Sarah's voice came back, harder now. "Mom worried about everyone. It's what she did, but her worries weren't always realistic. You know how she could get worked up about things." "What if they were realistic, Sarah? What if she saw something that the rest of us missed?" "Dad, I have to go. The kids need dinner and Marcus will be home soon. We'll talk later, okay? When you've had more time to process everything." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, then at Eleanor's carefully collected evidence. My daughter was slipping away from me just like her children already had. And somewhere in this mess of fear and manipulation, Marcus was pulling all the strings. I thought about his ultimatum, about the papers he wanted me to sign, about the threats to keep me away from Tommy and Lisa if I didn't cooperate, about the way he'd sat in Eleanor's chair like he already owned everything in this house. But what Marcus didn't know was that Eleanor had been 3 steps ahead of him. Whatever legal remedies she'd been pursuing, whatever case she'd been building, the evidence was right here in front of me. I picked up Eleanor's notes again, reading her final entry. "I won't let them suffer in silence. I won't let Sarah sacrifice herself and her children for a man who sees them as possessions to control. If something happens to me before I can finish this, I pray Melvin will find these papers and carry on what I started." I spent the rest of that evening going through Eleanor's hidden folder, piece by piece, like an archaeologist uncovering the ruins of my family. Each document told a story I'd been too blind to see, too trusting to question. There were bank statements showing irregular withdrawals from Sarah's account, small amounts but frequent. Eleanor had highlighted them in yellow, with notes in the margins. "Sarah says she's buying extra groceries but $300 every week," and asked about new clothes for kids. She got defensive. Changed subject. A printed email exchange between Eleanor and Tommy's school counselor caught my attention. The counselor had reached out first, expressing concern about Tommy's behavior changes. His grades had dropped, he'd become withdrawn during recess, and he'd started falling asleep in class. Eleanor's response was measured but desperate. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I've noticed changes at home as well. Tommy seems anxious around his father lately, and I'm wondering if there might be additional stress at home. Would it be appropriate for me to schedule a meeting to discuss support resources?" The counselor's reply was professional but pointed. "Mrs. Hartwell, I appreciate your involvement in Tommy's well-being. In my experience, children often reflect the emotional climate of their home environment. If there are stressors affecting the family dynamic, early intervention can be very beneficial." But the meeting had never happened. The email chain ended abruptly, with no follow-up from either party. I suspected Marcus had found out and shut it down. At the bottom of the pile, I discovered something that made my blood run cold, a handwritten timeline in Eleanor's precise script, documenting a pattern of escalating control. March 2023. Marcus insists Sarah quit her part-time job at the library. Says the family needs her full attention at home. April 2023. Sarah cancels lunch plans with me for the third time. Says Marcus needs the car for work meetings. May 2023. Notice Tommy has stopped talking about his friends at school. When I ask, Sarah changes the subject quickly. June 2023. Lisa comes to visit with a small bruise on her wrist. When I ask about it, she looks scared and says she's not supposed to talk about getting hurt. July 2023. Try to take kids to the park without asking Marcus first. Sarah panics, calls him repeatedly to make sure it's okay. August 2023. Sarah arrives at house with sunglasses on indoors. Won't remove them during entire visit. Claims she has a headache. September 2023. Tommy tells me he wishes they could live with us forever. Says their house is too quiet and everyone's always walking on eggshells. The timeline continued through October, right up until the week Eleanor died. Her handwriting grew more urgent, more desperate with each entry. October 10th, called legal aid office. Spoke with attorney about grandparent custody rights. She says we'd need to prove the children are in danger, which requires substantial documentation. October 12th, Sarah brought kids for Sunday dinner. Marcus wouldn't let them stay overnight, even though it's been a family tradition for years. Says they need to stick to their routine at home. October 15th, found out from neighbor that police were called to Sarah's house last week for a domestic disturbance. When I asked Sarah about it, she claimed it was a misunderstanding about a break-in alarm. October 18th, Tommy drew a picture at our house, stick figures of a family, but the father figure was separate from the others, colored in black crayon. When I asked about it, he said, Daddy doesn't like to be with the family very much. October 20th, made appointment with family court for next Tuesday. Decided I can't wait any longer for Sarah to ask for help. The children are suffering, and someone needs to speak for them. October 21st was the day Eleanor died. I set the timeline aside and reached for the last item in the folder. A sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Eleanor's careful script. My hands shook as I tore it open. My dearest Melvin, the letter began, and I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me before I could finish what I started. I pray I'm wrong, that we're reading this together someday and laughing about my dramatic tendencies. But if I'm right, if I'm gone and you're alone with this terrible knowledge, then you must know what I was trying to do. Our grandchildren are not safe, Mel. I know how hard that is to hear. I know you want to believe that Sarah chose a good man, that our family is intact and healthy. I wanted to believe it too. But love doesn't leave bruises, and good fathers don't make their children afraid to speak above a whisper. Marcus has isolated Sarah completely. She's financially dependent on him, emotionally manipulated by him, and too frightened to ask for help. The children have learned to be invisible, to avoid triggering his anger. This isn't the life we wanted for them. I've been documenting everything for months, building a case that could give us emergency custody if needed. The appointment I mentioned is crucial. The family court attorney believes we have grounds for a protective order, especially with the medical evidence and witness statements I've collected. If something happens to me, please don't let this evidence disappear. Please don't let Marcus intimidate you into silence. I know he'll try to isolate you from the grandchildren, to make you feel helpless and alone. He'll probably try to take over your business too. Men like Marcus see everything as territory to conquer. But you're stronger than he knows, Mel. You built a life from nothing, raised a daughter who was kind and bright before he dimmed her light. You can do this. You can save them. The attorney's name is Patricia Wells. She's expecting to hear from me. But if you call instead, she'll understand. Give her this folder. Tell her everything. She says grandparent custody cases are difficult, but not impossible when children's safety is at stake. I love you, my darling. I love our family. I love the grandchildren we were blessed with, and I won't let them grow up thinking this is what family should look like. If you're reading this, then it's up to you now. Please don't let me down. All my love, Eleanor. P.S. I hid photocopies of everything in the basement, inside the Christmas decoration box marked fragile. Marcus would never think to look there. I folded the letter carefully, my eyes blurring with tears I'd been holding back since the funeral. Eleanor had been carrying this burden for months, conducting a careful investigation while I remained obliviously focused on work and weekend dinners and the comfortable routine of our life together. She'd been trying to save our family while I was taking business calls during Sunday dinner, missing the signs that were right in front of me. The phone rang again, jarring me back to the present. This time it was an unknown number, but I recognized the voice immediately. "Mr. Hartwell? This is Patricia Wells from Legal Aid. I had an appointment scheduled with your wife for tomorrow morning, but I heard about her passing. I'm so sorry for your loss." I gripped the phone tighter. "Miss Wells, I found Eleanor's notes, the evidence she collected. I think I understand why she was coming to see you. Would you be able to keep that appointment instead? I think there are some things we need to discuss, especially given the urgency of the situation." I looked at Marcus's ultimatum, still sitting on my coffee table where I'd left it hours ago. Then I looked at Eleanor's careful documentation, her timeline, her desperate attempt to protect the children we both loved. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than it had been all day. "Yes, I'll be there." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my family's crisis. Marcus thought he held all the cards, that grief and age had made me weak and manageable. He had no idea that Eleanor had been planning for this moment, that she'd left me everything I needed to fight back. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than crushing despair. I felt the stirring of purpose, the quiet determination that had built my construction business from a single truck and a toolbox. Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the woman he thought he'd silenced, and the man he thought he'd broken. Tomorrow, I would learn exactly what legal options Eleanor had discovered. Tonight, I would honor her memory by preparing for the fight she'd started. Patricia Wells's office was smaller than I'd expected, tucked into a converted house downtown that served as headquarters for the county's Legal Aid Society. She was younger than Eleanor, maybe 50, with graying brown hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much human suffering. "Your wife was very thorough," she said after reviewing Eleanor's documentation. "In 30 years of family law, I've rarely seen a grandparent come this prepared." I shifted in the uncomfortable chair across from her desk. What exactly was she hoping to accomplish? "Emergency custody," Patricia said without hesitation. "Based on the evidence she'd collected, we were going to petition the court for temporary guardianship of your grandchildren while a full investigation took place." My heart pounded. "And you think we have a chance?" We had a chance. Your wife's documentation was compelling. The medical records, the behavioral changes, the pattern of isolation she'd identified. But now, she gestured to the papers spread across her desk. Now we're starting from a much more difficult position. Because she's gone. Because the primary witness is gone, and because time is working against us. Every day those children remain in that environment, every day that passes without intervention, makes it harder to prove immediate danger. Patricia leaned forward. "Your son-in-law has already made contact with a family attorney. He's being proactive." My stomach dropped. "What kind of contact?" "He's filed a petition requesting that your wife's concerns be dismissed as the unfounded worries of an elderly woman suffering from health problems. He's claiming she was paranoid, possibly experiencing early dementia, and that her accusations were part of a pattern of interfering with his family's privacy." The words hit me like physical blows. Marcus was attacking Eleanor's memory, her credibility, everything she'd worked so hard to document. Can he do that? Can he just dismiss everything she found? He can try, and unfortunately, without Eleanor here to testify about what she witnessed, without her personal account of the children's statements to her, our case becomes much weaker. Patricia gathered the papers into a neat stack. "I'm not saying it's impossible, Mr. Hartwell, but it's going to be an uphill battle." I drove home in a daze, Eleanor's evidence box on the passenger seat like a coffin full of futile hopes. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made a decision that would haunt me for days to come. I was going to sign Marcus's papers. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't bear the thought of never seeing Tommy and Lisa again. If playing along meant maintaining some connection to them, if surrendering control of my business meant staying in their lives, maybe I could find another way to help them. Maybe I could work from the inside, slowly, carefully. Maybe I was just a coward. That evening, I called Sarah to let her know I'd been thinking about Marcus's proposal. "Oh, Dad, that's wonderful," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Marcus will be so pleased. He really wants what's best for everyone." "Can I see the kids this weekend?" I asked. "Before I sign anything, I'd like to spend some time with them. Take them to the park, maybe get ice cream. A pause. Well, this weekend is pretty busy. Tommy has soccer practice and Lisa has a play date. Maybe the following weekend? But the following weekend, Tommy was sick. The weekend after that, Sarah was sick. Then the kids were visiting Marcus's mother. Then there was a school project. Then a family obligation. 6 weeks passed without me seeing my grandchildren. 6 weeks of excuses, of postponed visits, of phone calls that grew shorter and less frequent. Sarah's voice became increasingly strained, her explanations more elaborate and less believable. "The kids are asking about you," she said during one particularly painful conversation. "But Marcus thinks it might be confusing for them right now. They're still processing Grandma Eleanor's death, and too many changes might be overwhelming." "I'm not a change, Sarah. I'm their grandfather." "I know, Dad. I know. It's just complicated right now. Marcus says maybe after the holidays things will settle down." The holidays. It was still October. Meanwhile, Marcus's pressure intensified. He stopped by the office twice a week, always with some urgent business matter that required my signature, my approval, my gradual relinquishment of control. He'd restructured the company's billing system, changed our supplier relationships, even hired new foremen without consulting me. "Just temporary adjustments," he assured me each time, "to increase efficiency while you're dealing with your grief." But I noticed things. I noticed that the new foremen were his friends, men who owed him favors. I noticed that the restructured billing system funneled more money through accounts he controlled. I noticed that longtime employees, people who'd worked for me for decades, were suddenly finding reasons to quit or retire early. "Marcus is very demanding," my longtime secretary Ruth told me quietly one afternoon. "He wants daily reports on everything, who calls, who visits, what projects we're working on. It doesn't feel like the same place anymore, Mr. Hartwell." 2 weeks later, Ruth gave her notice. 30 years with the company, and Marcus had driven her away in less than 2 months. The isolation was systematic and thorough. Old friends stopped calling, either because Marcus had somehow poisoned them against me, or because they simply didn't know how to handle my grief. Sarah's excuses for keeping the grandchildren away became routine. My business was slipping away bit by bit, transformed into something I no longer recognized. And through it all, Marcus played the concerned son-in-law perfectly. He brought me groceries I didn't need, checked on me with calls I didn't want, offered to help with household repairs that didn't require fixing. To anyone watching, he looked like a devoted family member caring for an aging, grieving widower. The night I finally decided to fight back was the night I found Eleanor's hidden photocopies in the Christmas decoration box. She'd been even more thorough than I'd realized. Every document, every photo, every piece of evidence had been carefully duplicated and stored separately. But there was something else in the box, something I hadn't seen before. A small key taped to the bottom of a holiday ornament that had belonged to Eleanor's mother. I recognized it immediately. It was the key to our safety deposit box at the bank. I'd forgotten about that box. We'd opened it years ago to store important documents, birth certificates, insurance policies, Eleanor's grandmother's jewelry. We rarely accessed it, maybe once every few years when we needed something specific. The next morning, I drove to the bank with shaking hands. The safety deposit box was larger than I remembered, and it was nearly full. Along with our usual documents, Eleanor had stored additional copies of everything: her timeline, the medical records, photos, even a few items I hadn't seen before. At the bottom of the box was a manila envelope marked, "For Melvin, final evidence." Inside were bank records showing that Marcus had been slowly draining Sarah's personal accounts for months, transferring money to credit cards and investment accounts she probably didn't know existed. There were printouts of text messages between Marcus and someone named Kevin, discussing keeping the old man in line and making sure he doesn't cause problems. But the most damning piece of evidence was a small digital recorder, newer than the one I'd found in the recipe box. Eleanor had labeled it October 19th, final recording. I sat in the bank's privacy booth and pressed play. Marcus's voice filled my ears, cold and calculating. The old woman was getting too close. She was asking too many questions, making too many phone calls. "It's better this way." Sarah's voice, small and frightened. "What do you mean, better?" She was my mother, Marcus. She loved those kids more than anything. She loved interfering. She was going to destroy our family with her paranoid accusations. They weren't paranoid. You know they weren't. A long silence, then Marcus's voice. dangerously quiet. Are you questioning me, Sarah? Are you taking her side against your own husband? No, I miss her, and I'm worried about Dad. He seems so lost. Your father will be fine once he signs those papers and accepts reality. Eleanor filled his head with poison, but he'll come around. They always do. The recording ended there, but it was enough. Eleanor had captured Marcus, essentially confessing to causing her death. Maybe not directly, but creating the stress that had stopped her heart. She'd died knowing what he was, and she'd made sure I would know too. I sat in that small booth for a long time, holding the recorder, feeling the weight of Eleanor's final gift to me. She'd given me the evidence I needed, the proof that would expose Marcus for what he really was. But she'd also given me something more dangerous, the knowledge that my son-in-law was far more ruthless than I'd ever imagined, and that he'd already gotten away with silencing one person who'd threatened to expose him. The recording changed everything. For weeks, I'd been dancing around the edges of Marcus's manipulation, trying to convince myself that signing his papers might be the lesser evil. But hearing his cold admission about Eleanor, hearing him discuss her death like it was a solved business problem, ignited something in me I'd thought was buried with my wife. I called Patricia Wells immediately. "Mr. Hartwell, I wasn't expecting to hear from you again," she said when I reached her office. "I thought you'd decided to handle this as a family matter." "I've found new evidence," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "Eleanor left more than I initially discovered. Much more." 2 hours later, I was back in her cramped office, watching Patricia's expression shift from professional interest to genuine shock as she reviewed Eleanor's final recordings and financial documentation. "This changes everything," she said finally. "This isn't just about child welfare anymore. We're looking at financial fraud, emotional abuse, possible." She paused, studying the timeline Eleanor had created. "Mr. Hartwell, do you understand what your wife was implying about the circumstances of her death?" I nodded slowly. She was under enormous stress. Marcus knew she was building a case against him, and he made sure that stress became overwhelming. "We need to move quickly. With this evidence, we can file for emergency custody today. But you need to understand, once we do this, there's no going back. Marcus will know you've been investigating him, and he'll retaliate." "He's already retaliating," I said. "He's isolated me from my grandchildren, taken over my business, and tried to make me feel like a helpless old man. The only difference is that now I'm going to fight back." Patricia nodded grimly. "Then we file tomorrow. But tonight I suggest you prepare for the storm." I drove home with a strange sense of calm. For the first time in 2 months, I had a clear purpose, a definite course of action. Eleanor's investigation would not be in vain. But Marcus had been watching me more carefully than I'd realized. He was waiting in my driveway when I got home, leaning against his BMW with his arms crossed and an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, and completely without pretense. "Hello, Melvin. We need to talk." I kept my car keys in my hand as I approached the front door. "If this is about the business papers, I told you I need more time." "This isn't about business." Marcus pushed off from his car and followed me to the porch. "This is about loyalty, about understanding your place in this family." I unlocked my front door, but Marcus's hand shot out, holding it closed. I said, "We need to talk." "Then talk." Marcus smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "I know what you've been doing, Melvin. The visits to lawyers, the questions you've been asking about Eleanor's final weeks. You've been a busy man for someone who's supposed to be grieving." My heart hammered, but I kept my voice level. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do." Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Eleanor thought she was smart too. She thought she could document her little theories, build her case, cause problems for me and Sarah. Look how that worked out for her. The words hit like ice water in my veins. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you." Eleanor died from stress, Melvin. The stress of carrying around paranoid delusions, of seeing problems where none existed, of refusing to mind her own business. Marcus straightened up, brushing an invisible speck from his jacket. "Stress can be very dangerous for people your age. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents, all very common, very natural causes of death." I stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the man my daughter had married. Not the charming MBA with the 5-year plans, not the concerned son-in-law who brought groceries and offered help. This was someone else entirely, someone capable of standing on my porch and calmly discussing my wife's death like it was a lesson he'd taught. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want you to stop whatever foolish investigation you think you're conducting. I want you to sign those business papers and accept that your active role in this family is over, and I want you to understand that if you cause problems for me, for Sarah, or for our children, there will be consequences." "Our children?" Marcus's smile widened. "Tommy and Lisa are my children now, Melvin. Sarah understands that. It's time you did too. They're my grandchildren. Only if I allow it." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. It was a custody petition, already filed, requesting supervised visitation only for me based on concerns about my emotional instability following spouse's death and inappropriate interference in family matters. "Well, you're trying to cut me off from them completely. I'm protecting them from a confused, grief-stricken old man who's been filling their grandmother's head with paranoid fantasies. The court will see it exactly the way I present it, Melvin. Especially when they learn about your recent erratic behavior, your visits to lawyers, your attempts to undermine their stable home environment." I felt the folder of evidence in my jacket pocket, Eleanor's careful documentation that could expose everything Marcus had just admitted to. But I also felt the weight of his threats, the realization that he'd already outmaneuvered me legally. "Sarah won't let you do this," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. "Sarah will do exactly what I tell her to do. She's learned that cooperation is much easier than conflict." Marcus put his phone away. "Just like you're going to learn." "And if I don't?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Then you'll discover just how fragile life can be for elderly people living alone. Eleanor found out the hard way. I'd hate for you to follow her example." The threat hung in the air between us, crystal clear and utterly chilling. Marcus wasn't just talking about legal consequences or family isolation anymore. He was talking about something much more permanent. "You have until tomorrow evening to make your decision," Marcus continued, his tone returning to its usual professional smoothness. "Sign the papers, accept the custody restrictions, and stay out of my business, or face the consequences of your choices." He walked back to his car, pausing at the driver's door. "Oh, and Melvin? If you're thinking about running to the police or your lawyer friends with wild stories about threats and conspiracies, remember this. Who's going to believe a grieving widower with obvious mental health issues over a successful businessman with a spotless reputation?" The BMW purred to life, and Marcus drove away, leaving me standing alone on my porch with the full weight of his ultimatum settling over me like a shroud. That night, I sat in Eleanor's chair with her final recording playing over and over again. Marcus's voice, cold and calculating, admitting that Eleanor's death had been convenient for him. Sarah's frightened responses, showing just how completely he'd broken her spirit. I thought about the threats he'd made, the way he'd stood on my porch and calmly discussed my wife's death like a solved problem. I thought about Tommy and Lisa, trapped in a house where fear had replaced love, where silence had replaced laughter. Most of all, I thought about Eleanor's final letter to me. "Please don't let me down." By morning, I'd made my decision. But it wasn't the decision Marcus expected. I called Patricia Wells at 7 a.m. "We file today," I told her. "All of it. The custody petition, the financial fraud evidence, everything Eleanor documented. And I want to add a new element. I want protection for myself and my family from Marcus's threats. Mr. Hartwell, are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. Marcus will know you've declared war." I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the mantel, at her gentle smile and kind eyes. I thought about the months she'd spent secretly documenting the destruction of our family, the fear she'd carried alone, the courage it had taken to build a case that could save her grandchildren. "Eleanor started this war," I said. "I'm going to finish it." The papers were filed at 9 a.m. that morning. By 10, Patricia called to tell me that Marcus's attorney had already contacted the court, demanding an emergency hearing to dismiss what he called malicious and unfounded accusations by an unstable elderly man. By 11, my phone started ringing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. By noon, Marcus was back in my driveway, and this time, he wasn't alone. The emergency hearing took place 3 days later in a courthouse that smelled of old wood and nervous sweat. I sat beside Patricia Wells, my hands folded over Eleanor's folder of evidence, watching Marcus whisper urgently to his expensive attorney across the aisle. Sarah sat behind Marcus, her face pale and drawn, refusing to meet my eyes. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow, as if the weight of keeping Marcus's secrets had physically compressed her. Judge Morrison was a stern woman in her 60s who'd seen enough family destruction to approach every case with healthy skepticism. She studied the documents Patricia had filed with the kind of methodical attention that made Marcus's lawyer shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Morrison said, looking directly at me over her reading glasses, "these are serious allegations. You're claiming that your son-in-law has been financially exploiting your daughter, emotionally abusing your grandchildren, and threatening your safety. Do you understand the gravity of what you're requesting?" "Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely." Marcus's attorney, a polished man named Davidson, stood immediately. "Your Honor, this entire petition is the product of an elderly man's grief-induced paranoia. Mr. Hartwell has been unable to accept his wife's natural death and has constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid dealing with his loss." Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Natural death? Mrs. Hartwell died of cardiac arrest, Your Honor. A tragic but common occurrence for women her age, especially those dealing with stress and health complications." "And what kind of stress might that have been, Mr. Davidson?" Davidson glanced at Marcus before answering. Mrs. Hartwell had been experiencing some age-related cognitive difficulties. She'd become increasingly paranoid about her family's welfare, making unfounded accusations and creating unnecessary conflict. The stress of these delusions ultimately contributed to her fatal heart attack. I felt my jaw clench, but Patricia placed a steadying hand on my arm. We'd prepared for this line of attack. "Your Honor," Patricia said, standing smoothly, "I'd like to present evidence that Mrs. Hartwell's concerns were not only founded, but were part of a systematic documentation process that continued right up until her death." She handed the bailiff Eleanor's folder. Mrs. Hartwell was a retired nurse with 40 years of medical experience. She was methodical, careful, and deeply concerned about the welfare of her grandchildren. The evidence will show that her documentation was precise, detailed, and tragically accurate. Judge Morrison accepted the folder and began reviewing its contents. The courtroom fell silent except for the rustling of papers and the quiet tick of the wall clock. I watched Marcus's face as the judge examined photograph after photograph, read timeline after timeline. His confident expression began to crack around the edges. "Mr. Davidson," Judge Morrison said finally, "can you explain these medical records showing repeated injuries to the minor children?" "Children get hurt, Your Honor. They fall, they play rough, they have accidents. My client is a devoted father who ensures his children receive prompt medical attention when needed." "Prompt medical attention at 7 different medical facilities over a 6-month period?" Davidson's pause was telling. My client wanted to ensure the children received the best possible care. Judge Morrison set the papers aside and fixed Marcus with a steady stare. "Mr. Morgan, I'd like to hear from you directly. These records suggest a pattern of injuries and behavioral changes in your children. How do you explain that?" Marcus stood, his composure intact but his voice slightly strained. "Your Honor, my children are active, curious kids. Tommy plays sports, Lisa loves to climb trees. They're going to get bumps and bruises. As for behavioral changes, they've been dealing with the loss of their grandmother, which has been difficult for the whole family. And the financial irregularities your father-in-law has documented? I've been helping Sarah manage her finances during a difficult time. Her father was too grief-stricken to handle business matters, so I stepped in to prevent the family from suffering financial hardship." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Patricia. "Miss Wells, do you have additional evidence to present?" Patricia stood and pulled out the digital recorder I'd found in the safety deposit box. "Your Honor, I'd like to play a recording made by Mrs. Hartwell shortly before her death." Davidson shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. We have no way to authenticate this recording or verify when it was made." "Overruled. I'll hear it and determine its relevance." The courtroom speakers crackled to life and Eleanor's voice filled the space, steady and clear. "This is Eleanor Hartwell, recording on October 19th. I'm documenting a conversation I overheard between my son-in-law Marcus Morgan and my daughter Sarah." Then came the voices I'd heard in the bank. Marcus admitting that Eleanor's investigation had been dangerous, Sarah's frightened acknowledgement that her mother's concerns weren't paranoid, and Marcus's chilling response about Eleanor's death being better this way. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah had gone completely white, her hands pressed against her mouth. Marcus's lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, but Marcus himself sat frozen, his facade finally cracking completely. Judge Morrison replayed the recording twice before speaking. "Mr. Morgan, would you care to explain this conversation?" Marcus's voice came out as barely a whisper. "That recording is taken out of context. I was simply trying to help my wife process her grief. By referring to her mother's death as better this way, I meant it was better that she wasn't suffering anymore from her confusion and paranoia." But Judge Morrison was no longer listening to Marcus. She was studying a document Patricia had just handed her, Eleanor's final medical report, showing that she'd been in perfect cognitive health right up until her death. "Miss Wells, what are you requesting from the court?" Patricia stood with the confidence of someone who knew they held winning cards. "Your Honor, we're requesting emergency custody of Tommy and Lisa Morgan to be placed immediately with their grandfather, Melvin Hartwell, pending a full investigation into their welfare. We're also requesting a restraining order preventing Marcus Morgan from contacting Mr. Hartwell or the children during this process." Davidson made one last desperate attempt. "Your Honor, removing children from their home based on recordings of unclear context and normal childhood injuries would be—" "Mr. Davidson," Judge Morrison interrupted, "I've been doing this for 25 years. I know the difference between normal childhood accidents and systematic abuse. I also know the difference between grief-induced paranoia and careful documentation by a trained medical professional." She gathered Eleanor's evidence into a neat stack. "Emergency custody is granted to Mr. Melvin Hartwell, effective immediately. The children will be removed from the Morgan home today and placed in their grandfather's care pending a full Department of Children's Services investigation." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to shatter the last of Marcus's composure. He lunged toward the table where I sat, his face contorted with rage, but the bailiff stepped between us. "You have no idea what you've done, old man," Marcus snarled. "No idea what this will cost you." "Actually," I said, standing slowly and meeting his eyes with a calmness that surprised even me, "I know exactly what this will cost. It'll cost you everything, just like you cost Eleanor everything." As the bailiff led Marcus away, still shouting threats and denials, Sarah finally looked at me. Her eyes were filled with tears, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of fear. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't listen to Mom." 3 hours later, I was standing in my living room watching Tommy and Lisa explore the house they'd visited so many times before but would now call home. Tommy, no longer the withdrawn, frightened boy from Eleanor's photographs, was actually laughing as he showed Lisa the hiding spot behind Eleanor's bookshelf where they used to play hide-and-seek. Lisa, her voice no longer the whisper Eleanor had documented, was chattering about which bedroom she wanted, whether we could get a cat, and if Grandpa Melvin knew how to make pancakes like Grandma Eleanor used to. Sarah sat on Eleanor's couch, holding the custody papers with shaking hands. "Mom saved them," she said quietly. "Even after she died, she saved them." I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the mantel, at her gentle smile that had hidden such fierce determination. "She saved all of us, sweetheart. She just needed a little help finishing the job." That evening, after the children were asleep in the bedrooms Eleanor had always kept ready for them, I sat in her chair and opened her final letter one more time. "If you're reading this, then it's up to you now. Please don't let me down." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the recipe box where this journey had begun. Eleanor had trusted me with her greatest treasure, the safety of our family. She'd documented everything, anticipated every obstacle, even prepared for her own absence from the final battle. Marcus's threats had been real, his manipulation devastating, his control seemingly absolute. But Eleanor had been 3 steps ahead of him from the beginning, building a case so thorough that not even his expensive lawyers could dismantle it. The house felt different now, no longer empty and echoing with loss. Tommy's sneakers by the door, Lisa's drawings taped to the refrigerator, Sarah's hesitant but growing laughter as she slowly remembered what it felt like to be safe. Eleanor's recipe box sat on the kitchen counter where it belonged, no longer hiding desperate secrets but holding only what it was meant to hold, the ingredients for family meals, for normal life, for the future she'd fought so hard to protect. Outside, autumn was giving way to winter, but inside, something was finally beginning to heal. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.